Hello, welcome to the workshop. I've just received the next 4 issues to Building Kit from TV series Knight Rider, so let's get on and build. Let's start off with showing you what we've got this time. This is one of the free gifts when you subscribe. There's some posters and a little presentation folder sort of thing. They did come folded in the box, but they're not creased, so they should flatten out quite nicely. Issue 7. So on this one we've got some more of the front chassis. It looks like we've got some of the steering control arm sections. Right, so what we've got is we've got the front chassis rail. This is the left side. We have the steering column. We have some steering box top and bottom mounts. Got a couple of little joints. The steering gear. Oh, 2 parts steering gear. Got the upper arm. And then we've got some EM screws, GM screws, IM screws, and MM screws. So, as you can gather, all these parts are metal, with the exception, I think, of these little joints. That's why we've got so many M screws. So let's see what we need to do first. So the first thing I want us to do is start assembling the steering box. These look to be completely universal, and it just slots in there. I have to realise that this is also, these were all metal parts. I thought these might have been plastic, but they are metal. Okay, so what we're going to start off with is getting one of these little cross pieces and putting it in here. Now, normally I'd use oil on a piece of metal part, but these little ones, I don't know if I can pick that up on camera or not. These are actually already threaded, so we're not tapping a thread into these. So on this occasion I'm not going to use any oil to screw these ones in. Just going to line that up. Get it screwed in. Do the exact same thing on the other side. I'm not doing these up tight just yet. my guess is that they don't need to be fully tight, so there's some movement in them. So that's the first part done. Now we need to get the steering wheel on, and that will go joining onto this bit in the same fashion. And again, using 2 GM screws. And because the holes are already threaded, they go in quite easily. If you can get them lined up. So we've got effectively a little universal joint there. We turn to the other end of this and get our other joint, and like the same thing, we're going to be putting 2 GM screws in the end of this as well. And that's stage 1 to 3 done. So I've just realised there's a mistake in the printing of this magazine. The instructions here show you to put these screws from the top into the bottom. It's actually the other way around. There are no holes in this top cover. That will allow you to do that. So these are the parts. You've got the bottom cover, which has the holes, and you've got the top cover that has no holes in at all. So what we're going to do, still as the instructions say, put the worm gear in, put the pinion gear in, just ensure that they move, and then we're going to get the top cover, mount it on, but we're going to be securing them with some EM screws from the bottom through to the top. Because they're metal, I'm just going to dab a little bit of oil in each of the holes. And we'll secure them with these EM screws. And that's that step done. can see that when you spin this, the little output shaft spins as well. The next step we want to do, we're going to be mounting it to the chassis rail. And we're going to be mounting it to this side. Just through the two holes there. And we're going to be using screws for those. Dab of oil. And we're also going to be using an EM screw in this hole here. That's that steering box mounted to the chassis rail. We'll put that to one side because now we need, apart from our previous issues, we need the cross member, because we're going to be adding this piece on this side. We're going to be using IM screws to secure that in place. Just ensure that the holes all line up. Can be a bit tricky just to get them to line up. And tighten that up. I'll tighten this one up as well. And that's it for that stage. Okay, so moving on to issue 8, where we will need some of the other parts on the previous build, including the wheel. We're going to be building up the front suspension and attaching it to one of the front chassis rails. So this is what we've got for part 8. As you can hear, a lot more metal parts. So we have the left suspension lower arm. You can see that it's marked with an L, so we know it's the left one. We have a spring, quite a strong spring. We have front suspension lower joint. Front suspension upper joint. The shock absorber. Got front left and right reinforcements. These are also marked left and right. And we have the left and right suspension mounts. Again, also marked L and R for left and right. And then we got some more screws. We have some more IM screws, JM screws, GM screws, and some KM screws. So the first parts we're going to need for issue 8 is the member we've just brought in and these two suspension blocks, suspension mounts. They do have a left and a right on them, and they fit on to these two parts of the chassis, of the front chassis rail. And we're going to be securing those with 2 KM screws each. Start off the left side. And then the right side. They do have these little protrusions on them, and they do fit nicely into the slots on here. So they are keyed. Right, we now need to bring over our spring and our lower control arm. This is for the left side. So just going to put the spring in the recess, and then we're going to put this over the top, line up these holes, and we're going to be using an IM and a JM screw. The IM screw goes in on the wider side, ensuring the holes are lined up. And then on this side we are going to use a JM screw. So that's now mounted just like that. We're now going to be using this to slot into that lower hole, giving us a tab to secure the wheel to. Just bring in the wheel, and we're going to be using a KM screw, and it's going to be mounted in this fashion. After a few failed attempts, I found this to be the easier option to do it. Let the spring come out and just use the arm away from the main bulk of it and just get it with the wheel on the ground, and then you can get it to go in nicely. Just remembering to put the spring back in there. We now need to build up the shock absorber. So they just go together like that. And we're going to be using a KM screw for that. Dabbing some oil on it. Don't believe it matters which direction the screw goes in from. So we now have that, just like that. We're now going to be attaching this to the chassis in the same way we did that little pin. So it goes through this top hole and goes into the wheel, and we'll be securing that with another KM screw. Just need to load your screwdriver up. We need to compress that spring down. So that the holes line up to get the screw into. So that's now the front shock mounted. We now need to grab these two brace parts and we'll be putting them into the two holes here. Looks like they just press fit in. They are marked with a left and a right. So I'll just ensure that you put them the right way around. So put them in. They do feel quite loose, so, but I think they get secured in a little bit later on. So now we need to bring back in our chassis rail, and we're going to be mounting that to the car. Okay, so it's going to be mounted. Spin this the other way out. So this sits just on there, and we're going to be securing that in with a KM screw and a GM screw at the front. Just starting that off loosely. And then we'll do the front one. Again, just doing it loosely. And we can hold it up in place, and then we just tighten these up correctly without everything else falling off, because that bit's falling off. So that's the chassis rail attached there. Just ensure those are tight. So the next thing it wants us to do is in here, you can just about see there's two holes. It wants us to put 2 GM screws in those 2 holes. This would be where a magnetic screwdriver comes in very, very handy. This one does extend as well, which is useful. Just going to dip those. So in that hole now, there are 2 GM screws. You can just about see them, but they've gone into the 2 holes that on the bottom here. You can see, to securing that chassis rail in. And that's the end of it for that issue. Right, moving on to issue 9. And we're going to be doing the right side of the suspension and attaching the right suspension chassis rail. So I'm going to bring this part in that we did a minute ago. I'm also going to bring in the parts for this issue. So you have the right side lower suspension arm. Have another spring. You have the shock absorber parts. And we have the parts to make up the right hand rotor. We have the right side hub, right side brake disc, brake caliper, and a host of screws. Oh, almost missed this bit. That's the other part of the shock absorber. So the screws we have are JM, KM, GM, BP, and IM screws. So for issue 9, we need the chassis again. And we're going to need our spring and our lower suspension arm. And just like before, spring and then the suspension arm. And just like before, we're going to use an IM and a JM screw. So the IM screw is the longer one, the JM screw is the shorter one. Start off with the IM screw. Going to keep that a little bit loose just now while I put the JM screw in. So it's now tight. Come around, tighten up this one. And then, just as before, we're going to get this little pinion. And we're going to be putting that just in there, in that hole. We are then going to get the other steering knuckle. And we're going to be placing that in there as well. And we'll be doing the exact same thing we did before with a KM screw. Again, just ensuring that the hole lines up and making sure that's in there. That downstairs. Right, push that one back down, and it looks like we've got the same little shock absorber to build up. So just like before, I'm going to be joining those two together with a KM screw. again, I don't think it matters which way the screw goes through, just as long as it goes through and joins. It's now attached there, and then we're going to be doing the same process, putting that in there and lining up the holes and securing that also with a KM screw. What I have done with this, I've ensured that all the screws are facing the same direction. So this one you could have put in with the screw facing the other way. I don't think it matters, but I've just put all the screws facing the same direction. Same with this side. We now get to add in the chassis rail. So, as before, we're going to mount it from underneath, not forgetting to replace the bit that fell off. Just push that triangular brace bit back in. And then we'll be using a GM and KM screw respectively. So we have a KM screw at the back, so I have a KM screw at the back, and the front is secured with a GM screw. And that holds that piece in place correctly. We're going to need 2 more GM screws like we did before, with the 2 holes in there. Just ensure they're nice and tight. So we've got two of the screws in there. Right, we can put that to one side for now. And moving on to the brake rotor. So the first thing we want to do is get the caliper and the shield, put those two together, and we'll be securing those with 2 BP screws. And then with the rotor itself, we've just got these pegs and holes. We just need to ensure that they line up, making sure that the keyways are the same way up when we put them together. And then just press fit together to create the brake rotor. And that's it for that stage. Here we are, last part for today, issue 10. And we're going to be bringing in that bit again, and we're going to be building up some of the front suspension linkage and anti-roll bar. Here are the parts. So just work out what we've got. We have a tie rod, 2 tie rods, left and right. We have the center link. This is plastic. This is the front anti-roll bar. We have the left and right arms. A couple of little U-clamps. We have the brake line distributor. Anti-roll bar link. 2 of those. We have some brake line. We've got one that's longer, and we've got 2 shorter ones. So we've got left and right brake lines, they're the same length. And then we've got a longer one, which is the front brake line. We've also been given a pair of tweezers. They'll be going over there. I tend to use these style. Got a nice point to the end. We've also got some more screws. So we have some LM screws, some GM screws, DM screws, and we have some BP screws. So the first thing we need is the centre link and the right and left arms. Just looking at the orientation, it would appear that the arms go towards the back, with this facing upwards, and the left and right arms will be going on to the top of these. And we're going to be using a GM screw for those. A little bit fiddly to do, but that's that. I haven't tightened these screws up too much because this is going to be part of the steering linkage, and I think we want it a little bit fluid. Always adjust and tighten when it's on the car. Now I want the left and right tie rods, and these will be attached with these bumps facing upwards. Now, just looking if there's any markings for left and right. There don't seem to be. But you can see on the ends that these parts are bent slightly inwards. And looking at the illustration, that they would go and mirror the angle of the bar. So I'm angling them towards the back. So these are going to be secured from the back to the front with an LM screw. So you go through the centre bar, ensuring that these are facing down. I'm going to screw into the tie rod. Just going to do that gently for a minute. Same with this side. Trying to ensure that they go in straight. And that's left them again loose because the next stage we need to actually be adding this onto the car. So just bring the chassis back in. And we're going to be putting it so that it's linking the front steering together. So here, 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 and here, these 4 points. So it wants us to put it on there, on the steering box. The steering box does have a keyway. It's a square keyway on it, so it might be worth putting that one on first, and then adjusting the steering box to suit. Just about to see that I've moved the steering box so it's facing straight out now. We need to get these tie rods, and we just place them in the ends of the wheels. Just like that. And then we will be using a DM screw on this side and a GM screw on the steering box side. Start off with a GM screw on the steering box side. And one of these flanged DM screws on this side. So that's now secured in there. We now need to flip the car over, and we'll be securing these tie rods in the ends with 2 DM screws. I'm going to need to hold the tie rod from underneath and just secure it in with this DM screw. Again, I'm not doing these tight because I think it all has to move, and we can adjust when it's all together. Again, another DM screw in this side. Let's just check. So that's now steering. Now at the minute, depending on how this gets angled, I can see that these screws are catching on this peg on the chassis rail. So it might be something to look out for going forward when it comes to putting the steering wheel on. Hopefully it won't impact. That seems to be working absolutely fine now. I'm just going to go around and tighten up these screws just a touch to ensure they don't come out. still works, which it does. Okay, so now we need to move on to the front anti-roll bar. So we need to put these little pegs into the end of the anti-roll bar. It's got a little lug that locates in there, and we'll be securing those with BP screws. On that end, one the other end, again making sure the lug sits in that little slot in the anti-roll bar. I'm going to be adding this now into the car. And we'll be using these holes just on the lower anti-roll bar, or on the lower suspension arm, I should say. And there is a little indent within the within the lower arm that will just sit into. It also sits into a couple of grooves on each side of the chassis rails. We'll be securing those with another 2 BP screws. Just holding that in place and securing it. Exactly the same on the other side. And securing that in there. We now need the 2 little brackets that's going to secure the front of the anti-roll bar. So these have this little detail on them, and the detail goes towards the outer part of the chassis rails. And we're going to be securing those with 2 GM screws in each. Now I hadn't realised that the camera had stopped, but the next step was just to put these little junction points onto the brake block. They're just a push fit, just a bit of tubing. We've got one longer one and the two shorter ones. The longer one goes on the in the instructions it shows it this way up, so in the instructions it says put it on the left side for the longer one, and the other two go to the right and to the back. So the way it wants to mount it is this one, this block goes this way up, it's going to go onto this little peg, and we're going to be running the long one to the front of the car, one of the short ones to the left of the car, the other short one to the rear of the car, but the instructions say it will be going towards the right. We're just going to place that over that peg. Put a bit of oil in the middle of that. And we'll be using a GM screw for that. And then all we need to do is we feed this left hand line through, and then on the back of the wheel there's a small peg, and we're just going to put that brake line onto that peg, onto the back of the caliper. It says to feed this one the same way, and that will obviously go onto the back of the caliper when we have that one fitted in a future issue. And then the front one must go towards the engine bay, but for now I'm just going to wrap it around so it doesn't get damaged. And that is it for that issue and for the series for now. Thank you very much for joining me in the workshop today. So that's KITT done for another month. If you enjoyed that video, please do give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more projects like that one going through the workshop, please remember to hit that subscribe button and ding that bell. I'll see you around.